Imagine being called the most beautiful woman alive, yet surviving on only 2 meals a week. That was Wilhelmina Cooper. She rose from an ordinary girl in post-war Europe to the face of Paris couture, her elegance stamped on hundreds of magazine covers. Later, she built an empire that still bears her name. But behind the glossy images was a woman who carried scars no camera could capture, from childhood tragedy to an industry that demanded she starve herself to fit in. And in the end, even her success couldn't save her from a life cut short. So how did Wilhelmina, the model who seemed to have everything, end up paying the ultimate price? Wilhelmina's story didn't begin in the studios of New York or the couture houses of Paris. It began in Holland in 1939 when she was born Gertrude Bamenberg, just months before the world was engulfed in war. Her early years were shaped by ration books, bomb sirens, and the constant unease of living in occupied Europe. Childhood for her was never simple. Food was scarce, fear was constant, and survival meant growing up far too quickly. One memory would mark her forever. At 6 years old, she set out hand in hand with her younger brother to collect the family's daily rations. The streets were alive with noise that day. It was victory in Europe. The war was over, Canadian soldiers were celebrating, their trucks weaving through the crowd. Amid the chaos, one of those vehicles swerved, and in an instant, her brother was struck and passed away. What should have been the moment of liberation was, for Wilhelmina, the moment she learned how fragile life could be. After the war, the family tried to rebuild in Germany, but the weight of the past was impossible to shake. By the time she was 15, they crossed the Atlantic, beginning again in Chicago. It was another culture, another language, another attempt at normal life. Tall, striking, and still foreign, she stood out at Waller High School. She didn't quite fit in with the American teenagers around her, but she had already discovered a world where she did belong, in the glossy pages of fashion magazines. She hunted down old issues in secondhand stores, poring over every page until she could recite them by memory. "I read them cover to cover," she would later say, devouring every word and every picture of my new idols. For the girl who had seen war and loss before she could even spell the words, the fantasy of fashion offered something different. Beauty, control, escape. It wasn't long before she decided to chase it. With borrowed money from her father, she enrolled in modeling school, reinventing herself as Winnie Hart. In 1958, diploma in hand, she joined Models Bureau. Yet, the path ahead wasn't as glamorous as she had imagined. At 5'11", and with curves that magazines considered excessive, she didn't fit the fragile ideal of the late 50s. Patricia Stevens, a booker, made that point with cruel clarity when she invited Wilhelmina for coffee and told her, "Enjoy this meal, because you won't have another until you lose 30 pounds. It was her first real lesson in the industry. Beauty wasn't enough. To survive in fashion, she would have to sacrifice far more than she ever imagined. Wilhelmina didn't walk away after that cruel coffee shop warning. She doubled down. If fashion demanded sacrifice, she would prove just how far she was willing to go. Weight began to drop. Not just from discipline, but from sheer determination to belong to a world that told her she didn't fit. Paris was the next step, and with it came both glamour and danger. On the surface, it was everything she had imagined. Couture runways, glossy shoots, late nights in a city that seemed made for beautiful girls. But beneath that shine was the unspoken rulebook of the industry. Other models handed her diet pills, the quick fix that kept hips narrow and faces hollow. She took them, and soon described walking down the Champs-Élysées half-dazed, cars flying past, her body feeling nothing. That was when she settled into a routine that sounds almost impossible today. "I ate twice a week," she admitted later. The rest of the days were cigarettes and black coffee. On Wednesdays, maybe a bowl of soup or a cracker with cheese. That was it. It wasn't living, It was survival. "I wasn't fat in real life," she said, "but in modeling I certainly was." And still, the industry rewarded her for it. After a year in Paris, she landed her first L'Officiel cover, the stamp of approval that every young model dreamed about. And for Wilhelmina, there was pride in that moment. To see her own face staring back from a magazine, to be chosen to wear Dior or Chanel, it was a kind of validation that money alone couldn't buy. The little girl who once scavenged old-fashioned magazines in Chicago was now inside them, shaping the very world she had idolized. When she came back to New York, she wasn't the awkward girl from Chicago anymore. She was Wilhelmina, tall, poised, aristocratic, a woman who had starved herself into fashion's definition of beauty. From there, everything accelerated. The early 60s made her one of the most in-demand models in the world. Her look, 5'11", high cheekbones, dark hair swept into towering styles, became the standard of elegance. She was booked out weeks in advance, shooting in South America, India, Hong Kong, even Lapland. The schedule was relentless. 12-hour days, no holidays, no real pauses. To outsiders, she seemed unstoppable. Hairstylist Kenneth Patel remembered how she would step out of her limousine, makeup already flawless, bags of hairpieces in hand, ready to shoot within minutes. It looked effortless, but the truth was different. Behind the glassy poise was a body running on fumes, driven more by fear of rejection than by luxury. Perfection paid well, $100,000 a year by the mid-60s, but it came at a cost that no paycheck could cover. By the mid-60s, Wilhelmina was on top of the world. The covers, the campaigns, the endless travel, her face was everywhere. But if there's one thing she understood, it was that modeling careers didn't last forever. Agencies were already shifting their attention to a new wave of girls, and she could feel the spotlight slipping. In fashion, you're only as good as your next picture. Around this time, she met Bruce Cooper, a TV producer who was smooth, connected, and knew how to work a room. They married in 1965, and from the outside it looked like she had found her match. The supermodel and the media man, New York's golden couple. But of course, the picture-perfect story wasn't real. It rarely was with Wilhelmina. When the bookings dried up, she made a move nobody expected. Instead of fading away, she and Bruce started their own agency, Wilhelmina Models. It was a gamble. People laughed at the idea that a model could run a business. But she proved them wrong. The name carried weight, the phones rang, and within a few years, the agency was worth millions. Suddenly, she wasn't just working in fashion, she was shaping it, and she did it differently. Most agency heads were distant figures. Wilhelmina was in the office every day, talking with the girls, teaching them how to pose, showing them the tricks she'd learned the hard way. She was direct, but never cruel. In a 1970s documentary, she's seen evaluating a new model.
The last time you checked,
Nebraska.
I love the way you look. I think that you really have a very, very good look for this business. I would say yes, I'd really like to try it with you, but now come the negatives. I think what we have to do is first of all lose some weight, okay? Because it's going to help you here. Now turn your face profile, let's see. Very nice profile, but you can still use the weight loss in this area, yeah.
Okay.
Okay?
It was honest feedback delivered with warmth. Gia Karangi, Naomi Sims, Iman, they all passed through her doors. For some, she became a mentor, even a mother figure. She was tough, but she cared. And in an industry that ate girls alive, that mattered. In her famous rap sessions, she'd give girls survival advice with characteristic bluntness.
And you convince him that you're absolutely brilliant and wonderful. And I think this is literally give him an ear. You know, you're going to have to sit there and talk it through. You can't be rude because then he's not going to take a picture. Maybe then you can start going into your problems that are not real. I mean, I really don't want you to divulge your real problems. Do you know what I'm saying?
It was protection disguised as practical advice. But while the business thrived, her marriage told another story. Bruce cheated openly, sometimes even with her own models. And worse, he was violent. Friends remembered her showing up to jobs with bruises, covered with makeup, never explaining, never complaining. This was the 70s. Women didn't talk about abuse, especially not women whose image was their currency. So she kept it quiet, stayed for the sake of her children, and carried on. In public, she was Wilhelmina, the elegant founder, the woman who had built an empire from scratch. In private, she was enduring a marriage that was breaking her down. 2 lives, running side by side. One powerful, one powerless. By the end of the 70s, Wilhelmina's life looked like a study in contradictions. Her agency was thriving, her name had real power in fashion, yet privately she was holding together a marriage that left her bruised and exhausted. And just when it seemed she had found a way to endure everything, her body gave out on her. What began as pneumonia didn't pass. She was used to pushing through illness. Years of 12-hour days and transatlantic flights had trained her to keep going. But this time the recovery never came. The diagnosis was devastating. Lung cancer. Inoperable. She was only 40 years old. For someone who had survived so much, the news felt cruel. Friends and colleagues were stunned, but Wilhelmina didn't retreat. If anything, she leaned in harder. She still showed up at the agency, still traveled to scout girls in Europe, still took the time to sit with young models who saw her as a mentor. It was as though she knew her time was running out and wanted to leave every bit of herself in the world she had fought so hard to shape. In March of 1980, Wilhelmina's body finally gave in. She was just 40 years old. News of her death spread quickly, but for those who knew her, it didn't feel real. How could a woman who had built her entire life on endurance suddenly be gone? Models who had passed through her agency were heartbroken. Gia Karangi spiraled without her, losing the one figure in the industry who had ever truly looked out for her. As portrayed in the film about their relationship, Wilhelmina's mentoring philosophy captured her relentless drive.
You have the whole world at your fingertips. You have to be strong. Seize the moment. Because if you don't, there is always another girl waiting right behind you, breathing over your shoulder.
The tributes in magazines praised her beauty, her elegance, her discipline. But words like those had followed her all her life. They were true, but they were never enough. What Wilhelmina left behind was bigger than an image. She had survived war, loss, starvation, and abuse, and still managed to carve out her own power in an industry that never wanted women to hold it. That is her legacy. And her name didn't fade with her. The agency she founded kept growing long after 1980, pushing through the 80s and 90s to become one of Ford's fiercest rivals. Half a century after its founding, it celebrated the milestone with a glossy Rizzoli book, Wilhelmina, Defining Beauty. A reminder that the agency's story wasn't just about contracts, but about how the definition of beauty itself shifted across decades. For the industry, it was a way of saying that Wilhelmina hadn't just created a company. She had helped set the terms of the conversation. The agency itself didn't just survive, it became one of the big four American powerhouses, standing alongside Ford, Elite, and Next. That was the scale of what Wilhelmina had built, her name carved into the same league as the giants she once competed against. Models she mentored never forgot her either. Iman later remembered Wilhelmina as one of the rare agents who treated her as a person, not a product. Outside, though, her personal story is often forgotten. Wilhelmina is a brand now, a logo, a shorthand for a powerful agency. But the woman behind it, with all the scars and sacrifices that shaped her, has faded into the background. And maybe that's the sharpest irony. The industry kept her name, but not her story. She used her face to open the door, and her will to keep it open for others. But the cost was everything she had. So more than 40 years later, we have to ask, has fashion learned from her story? Or is it still repeating the same mistakes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.